Yeah, I'm Jessica Koslow. I started Squirrel in 2011, and it really was started with the guise of fermentation and preservation at the heart of it. We make about 35,000 jars of preserves every year, and I thought we were doing something really interesting until I met René and David. I first met René at a Mad Leadership Summit in New Haven, Connecticut. And what surprised me about him, I guess a couple things. For a man who is one of the best chefs in the world and is also the man behind a restaurant that has been the best restaurant in the world for 4 years in the past, or 4 times in the past decade, he's really humble. You're a humble guy. And you also have an insatiable curiosity about life. And I think that that curiosity is really what has already developed this irreplaceable book. Later that year, this was 2016, later that year I went to Mad in Copenhagen and had the luxury and honor of eating at Noma. And afterwards, Dr. Ariel Johnson took me on a tour of the fermentation lab, and I met David. The first thing David did was give me a white fruit roll-up, and I put it in my mouth, and he said, "Tastes like pork, right?" It was blood plasm that that had been plasma that had been pig's plasma that had been centrifuged and then dehydrated and turned into basically pork. It was not a fruit roll-up. I was not prepared for that, but it was an instant friendship that we had. 2 years later, here we are, a brand new Noma. 2 books to talk about. One is You and I Eat the Same, and the Noma Guide to Fermentation, and a fermentation lab at the heart of it that David runs. So please help me in welcoming these 2 to Los Angeles. Off topic, how's it going in LA? When did you get here? How's it been?
Well, we got in just this morning. It's been very much a whirlwind tour, kind of like one city a day. We have the luxury of spending kind of like a day and two days here in LA.
And René ate some tacos backstage, so he's getting a good sense of LA.
Yeah.
Let's talk about dispatches. Give the audience a little overview of what the Mad Symposium is and how You and I Eat the Same came to be.
Well, the symposium started almost a decade ago, and it's called Mad. Mad means food in Danish. Mad, actually, that's how we pronounce that. Oh. Mad. What started out as an annual symposium has grown into something more, and we want it to be more. We want it to be part of positive change. And so from a symposium, we're trying to build a school for our industry to learn different things, a place for, if we have a sous chef, if we have a cook we want to promote to a sous chef, you might send them to a 2-week course at the Mad School in Copenhagen to learn something about how to be with people. Not that we need that in our industry, of course. And then there's all these series of other things we do where we try to talk about food and figure things out about food-related issues. And so we have a book series now for Mad. And in the first issue, it's Chris Ying that's the main editor, and he really drives the creative work. It's called You and I Eat the Same, and there's all these wonderful stories about how food connects you, but also how sometimes incredibly similar cultures are when you study them. And there's particularly one that's amazing. It's on flatbreads, and it turns out almost everywhere in the world you have some sort of flatbread, and you put something inside, and then you wrap it, and it's a really good. I like it a lot. It makes you think.
I mean, burritos and bings, for example, and then also a sesame series.
Falafels. I mean, it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah. In this book, David, you write about your experience with shoyu and how you have this drive to develop shoyu but indexicality ultimately stops you from being able to put it on the menu at Noma. Since this has been written, have you been able to find a way to get it into a dish at Noma? What is
indexicality?
Indexicality.
Yeah.
And tell us about that journey of developing shoyu.
Yeah, well, when I started in the fermentation lab, there were definitely a lot of staples that we used. And speaking about the way that we approach ferments at Noma, we're often looking abroad. While we do study a lot of Nordic traditions and, slowly ferment or age and salt fish and things like that, things that have been done in Scandinavia for a long time. We also look to other cultures to try and understand what they do, and then, put that through a Nordic lens, through Noma's philosophies, and then use ingredients from where we are with ideas from elsewhere. It's worked really great for things like miso or vinegars. And then soy sauce is one that we'd always had a little bit of trouble with. It was something that I started doing tests on maybe after a year in the lab, so it kind of came to us a little bit late. But we would make it instead of with soybeans, we would make it with yellow peas and Danish ingredients.
Like rye bread. Or riso.
Yes. So that's a miso that we make with rye bread.
So it's not a miso.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, when you say we make misos, they're not misos.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit confusing. It's not actually miso because there's no soy in it.
Exactly.
It's made with rye and all these other things that belong in it. So it tastes quite different.
Mm-hmm.
But the inspiration of it comes from miso.
Definitely. So we tried to do that exact same thing with soy sauce and use Danish yellow peas and Danish wheat. And while it tasted different, it definitely tasted like a really, really well-made soy sauce. It tasted very much like soy sauce. There was something about the process that reminded you of a really great Japanese soy sauce that you would have, at a sushi counter somewhere.
So indexicality.
Yeah, so that would always bring you back. And indexicality is, well, when you talk about, if you say the word red, you picture a color. And even if you write the word red in blue, your brain kind of like a little bit. Mm-hmm. So that same thing was happening. We were making a product with ingredients from somewhere else, but you were still taken back to Japan. And in a Nordic restaurant, that always caused a little bit of, just a little bit of tension. And so it was hard to implement in the menu.
Although I'd say the umami that you're getting from whether it's the garum, I would say the garum, it's adding a layer that does feel like it's progressing beyond Nordic food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, what is Nordic food?
I know.
And it's changing, that's for sure, which is a good thing. And it needs to all the time. If you just get stuck in tradition, most of them will fall behind. I mean, a lot of these old school food stuff, if you're 15, 16, 18, 22 years old, you don't care about that. I mean, you want something where you feel, okay, now this is how I like to eat. Why can't we push that forward?
How has your view of Nordic food changed since you opened Noma?
A lot. I mean, first of all, it's this special situation where I didn't grow up eating Nordic food. And I mean, my family background, the story of that is based on my father coming to Denmark when he was like in his 20s from a tiny little village in what was Yugoslavia, a little tiny Muslim community. And so I grew up eating mostly Turkish food, actually, spicy food even. And so when we opened up Noma, Nordic food to me, like I think to also a lot of other people actually, was just very, very basic. It was like liver, chicken liver, pork liver, liver paste, rye bread, licorice. That's basically what most Danish people are built on, those three things: rye bread, liver, licorice. And it was a cuisine that was based on sort of filling yourself, I guess, and not showcasing the diversity that's actually there. A lot of people say it's because of the religion of us coming from the cold Protestant North, in which that it's sort of dictated to you that taking enjoyment in things like eating is one of the most sinful things you can do. And there's some truth to that, actually. I mean, but there's some truth that maybe this is one of the reasons why. Maybe you watched Babette's Feast or read the book. If you can watch it online on YouTube. It's a great movie that talks about that a little bit.
But there is a moment in the book in which you talk about tasting a gooseberry in a way that you'd never had before. I'm sure you've had them fresh and dry. But when your team fermented gooseberries and you tasted that, I feel like that was a real awakening moment for Noma. That created the Nordic Food Lab, that created the first iteration of the fermentation lab at Noma, and now where we are today. So let's talk about that.
That moment. Well, we're 15 years old this year, and when we started out, it was in 2003, November 23rd, and I was 25, and it was cold. It was winter, not like your winter, an actual real winter. And from that moment on until now, it's just been this series of, I'm not going to say accidents, but almost. There's these 2, 3, 4 defining moments that just like, whoa, that sort of awakens the next period in your journey. And obviously the first one was stepping into the wilderness. Luckily, it was a cold winter that year we opened, and we thought that it was going to be a disaster for us to do this, but it forced us to read. It forced us to take in books that we never read about before, and nobody ever told us as cooks that we needed to understand, So we did that, and then that was the first defining moment, and then at a certain point you're like, what can I do with all this wilderness, all these ingredients we have? How do I take them into the next season? How do I take them into winter? And then we start investigating into preservation and pickling and all sorts of things. And at a certain point, that leads to fermentation. And at a certain point, somebody, I think it's a guy called Torsten, fermented some gooseberries. And because obviously once you start reading about fermentation, you will inevitably do sauerkraut. That's like the first step in being a fermenter. And it's also what a lot of people think fermentation is about. Once we start studying this and we could see, okay, what is it actually? And we understand about a lactic acid fermentation. We understand about the salt. We understand that you can put other things. It doesn't just need to be cabbage that's put with the salt. Somebody did a gooseberry one, and it gets forgotten, and then at a certain point, I get this spoon stuck in my face, and there's a murky liquid on it. And that's the thing about fermentation. It's the least Instagrammable thing in the entire food world. You have beautiful ingredients, and then 6 months later, they're all brown. And so I taste this, and that was again another of these moments where okay, here's a thing I've eaten always, and why have I never tasted it like this before? Why is this so much more than what I thought it could be? And that was the gooseberry. That was lactic acid fermentation. And from that moment on, it was just full throttle in our world of fermentation. And from that moment on, it's become, fermentation is our blood at Noma. There is not one food, one dish in any menu, in any given time of the year that doesn't have something in it that Dave and his team has created.
Yeah, I'd like to say that the time that Noma started, there was every 3 Michelin star restaurant around you.
We only have 2. Huh?
2.
We actually have 0 right now.
Yeah. It was all about molecular gastronomy.
Yeah.
But you moved away from that in a period where that's where people were going. You said no, and you said, look, my trick, my technique is going to be time. And that's a really important thing to think about, is that the time, the fermentation, that time is leading you to dishes that really cannot be, you can't compare. So how did you decide to move away from what everyone else was doing? Yes, you're looking...
I remember the moment quite vividly, because, today we have this restaurant where we have all on hand, we have all the equipment, but we weren't like that when we first opened. Yeah. I have zero money, and I used to have much, we had nothing. So opening a restaurant was like a big deal, and we were a tiny, tiny team. We had 6 gas burners, and it was, the era of big technique, of machinery. And at a certain point, I'm like, we can never get to this. We just can't afford it. So we're gonna use our hands. That was like the let's use our hands and our imagination in a different way. I'm not against it at all, but it was just a different approach that we were sort of forced into, in a way. And so I remember that menu when we said that. We did this serving of a tartare. It's 13 years ago, and everything had to be handmade. It would be scraped by hand and all these things, and then you had to eat it with your hands as well. And it was a really moment. It's a lot of these things when you talk about it today, it sounds crazy because it sounds normal, but who can even remember how the world was 13 years ago? There wasn't even Instagram, or you could smoke in every restaurant in Copenhagen.
Plain still, I think.
Yeah.
Too.
So that was the moment when the crafted, the handwork was a focus, and the people.
Talk about people. Hi, David.
Hi.
The last time I saw David, he was showing me garum that he was making from 250 squirrels. How did you end up doing that?
Well, yeah.
You're from Canada.
Yep.
What brought you to Noma? How did you go from being a part of the team to really leading the fermentation lab?
Well, I'd cooked in Canada my whole life. Not my whole adult life. And I was working as a sous chef at what was the time Canada's best restaurant. It was maybe in my late 20s then. And I was getting offers to open things up, and I didn't feel ready. By any objective standard, I was ready to just open a restaurant and lead a team, but I didn't feel like I'd seen enough. Canada's a bit provincial. You think about it on the world map, and it's kind of stuck away in a corner of the world. It's not so easy for Canadians to work in the States, so I didn't have that option. So I had to send resumes abroad, and Noma got back to me very quickly. I wrote an excessively long cover letter that a lot of people told me not to write, but I did it anyway.
I can see René liking that.
And some people over there caught wind of it and were like, this guy's strange. We just have to get him in to see what he's about. And I came over for a trial.
In science?
I don't. I have a high school diploma. I started cooking when I was still in high school, and I just never stopped. But I have a big bookshelf. I don't think I've read a book of fiction in, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years, but I read probably about a book a month. So that's just a lot of science as disparate as anthropology to cosmology to quantum physics to, social issues. So I just like to stay informed. And that serves me, oddly enough, in a kitchen, because you kind of are able to connect dots, if you will. And I started in the kitchen at Noma. I was just on the cold section. I worked on the barbecue.
What year was this?
This was in early 2014. And then, you work in a restaurant, people are going to ask you questions. Oh, why'd this end up like that? Or, hey, Dave, have you seen the plunger? And my answers were always a little bit too smart for my own good, I think. And after working at Noma for about a year, on the behest of René and the team in the lab, the head chef at the time sat me down after work. I thought I was getting canned, and they're like, would you like to work in the fermentation lab? And I said, this is a chance of a lifetime, so absolutely.
And were you already working on, or was the team already working on the book at the time?
No.
So how long have you been working on the book? And how long did it take you to kind of develop?
2 years.
Yeah. Yeah, it was July 2016. You came into the lab one day and you're like, we need to write a book. And we're like, okay.
A book,
sure.
a book people can cook from. That was also.
Yeah, your vision was very clear. I remember it, and you also said this shouldn't just be my voice. You know, you're like, it's.
Well, it would be so wrong because I am not a specialist at all in fermentation. David is a specialist. It's his work. What we're able to do at Noma is that we have all these different kitchens and places where we're specialized, but there are people in it that make it special. And they're so much better than I can ever do. I just try to be in the middle and sort of take the best things and sometimes come with some feedback. So it is as much Dave's book as it is my book. And I also think, you know, it would be fantastic, and I think it's actually daring for Artisan to do it, you know, because they were like, at first it was a little bit, but it's time that we bring out people like Dave, that is so important to the restaurant, and showcase that.
Yeah, it's interesting. The book itself, any recipe that's in here, you have two ways that you've shown it. You've shown it cryoed, where it seems like it's perfect for a chef if you have a cryovac machine, or a chef that doesn't, or a home cook can do it in jars. And you take the time to show how it can work in either way.
Yeah.
How long did it take to shoot that and to actually?
It took 3 weeks.
12 hours a day, 3 weeks.
This is also a little funny. I'm also a photographer, and
you shot?
well, no, I didn't. We hired a really amazing food photographer, Evan Sung. But when we were deciding on the final steps of the like how we're going to put this together, that was actually in Noma, Mexico, and there were photographers on the table. The publisher was there, and I remember the conversation. It's like, who should we get? And we're like, oh, would Evan Sung be good? And he's like, yeah, I think he might be our guy. And then I just, like, sheepishly raised my hand and like, I could shoot the book. And then René was like, David, you'll have enough on your plate already.
Is he right?
And then in my mind, I was like, no, but this will make me have less on my plate, because if you hire a photographer and you're making a book on fermentation and you bring him in for a block of time, you have to make everything 5 times so that you can do the time lapse in like 1 day. So that's what I had to do. And actually, I could have just set up a little studio and then shot things as they aged, but this way I had to
just.
And the new restaurant, the fermentation lab was not open yet, or were you in there doing this?
Well, this book had the surprising good fortune of being completed while Noma was in between restaurants. So yes, we had a small pop-up going, a bistro-style pop-up going at Under the Bridge.
And you were able to.
Noma at 93 Strandgate, in the home that many people have seen it in, had just closed. We just got back from Mexico, and the new Noma was under construction. So, you know, there was a small team, the test kitchen chef, working on development, and then I was in the lab working on development and this, and it actually afforded me the time to do this really well.
Noma has gone to Tokyo, Sydney, Tulum, London in its early days-ish. Maybe here someday. What have you picked up from these travels that you've brought back into the fermentation lab, and how have they found their way into dishes in the restaurant?
Every time we go somewhere, we come back with a good idea, really. It's true. We only started making shoyu or soy sauce in the lab after we got back from Japan, and I saw a real soy sauce factory and was like, oh, okay, now I get how this works, and I really can understand it.
Same thing for koji, using the barley from Scandinavia, or?
No, those things happened before we ever went to Japan, or
I went
know
to
that
Japan.
You went on some trips yourself.
I was on this one journey where I interned in Japan. And after that, we started doing koji. It's like 7, 8, 9 years ago or something.
Yeah.
The most recent menu, are you on the game menu yet?
Yeah.
So the vegetable menu that just passed, there was an ice cream sandwich at the end, where the cookie was actually koji?
Yeah, it's a pancake. It's a mold pancake.
Mold pancake. I'm assuming that is not in the suggested uses in here.
No, it's not.
But there are a lot of suggested uses in here that are really amazing for home cooks, whether it's the salted plum on yogurt, the blueberries that go on corn. Blueberry and corn's a great combination. Where are these suggested home ideas coming from?
It was
honestly, we just did it. I mean, we just spoke about it and thought to ourselves, how will we do it at home? And actually, we have them at home, these ferments.
Yeah. All the failures are like, okay, this wasn't on the menu, and we have like a couple liters left over. Like, I'll take a couple bottles home. Some of the guys from the kitchen will ask for some. I know that chef has a bunch in his kitchen. And a lot of this is just how you end up cooking with it if you're a chef and you have these things on hand.
So we see some successes, and we see what you can do with these ingredients. What have you tried to make that ultimately was like, wow, that did not work at all?
Yeah, there's a famous one. It's always the same answer, and that's blood garum. So yes, you had that blood pancake when you came to Noma, and that was fine.
Yeah.
But if you try to ferment blood, you will run into an ugly beast. It just smells wrong, it tastes wrong. I got clever once, and this was done by Ariel Johnson and the team before me, many years before I even started, and then I revisited it and was like, but I can solve it. We'll just use the centrifuge. We'll take out the hemoglobin. That's why the plasma was around. And I'll just ferment the plasma, and then we won't have that smell. And then, no, it came back.
It's really, really bad. It's like almost like the holy grail for us to figure out what can we do with blood, because it's a traditional thing. It's a traditional ingredient. But in the fermentation kitchen, people are used to funky notes and flavors. But then this is like all the funk together.
And then you really want to make it happen and work, and it just,
beets also are very difficult, we discovered. Beets, for some reason, are very weird. One time, I can't remember what we did. We did something with beet. Was it a kombucha? As in, I'm sure here somebody, this is like a kombucha headquarters in Los Angeles. I'm sure somebody made a successful beet kombucha, but we never did, and it actually turned like
ropey. It's called
ropey, yeah,
for good reason.
Like you can have when we tried to drink it, some of it was in your belly, and the other was still like stuck to your tongue.
So it wasn't liquid. It was
somewhere in between.
Yeah. And on the flip side, some things that really came out of the lab that you were surprised. I mean, that chicken wing garum, to me, tasting that was one of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But some things that you were surprised by. And also, books are really an amazing moment in time. They show what you're doing in the moment, and then it goes to publish.
Yeah.
And you're working on a bunch of new stuff now.
Yeah,
there's a sonic machine that was helpful in kind of developing some NA beverages when I was there last. So maybe talk about this new practice that you're...
Yeah, well, and when René was talking about, being in the middle and then taking the best of, you don't want to call it a department, but a kitchen or someone's work, and like, okay, what do you have to offer? Oh, these 3 things are really amazing. Those 3 things might be really amazing, it might make it on the menu, but there's actually 97 other things you were working on, but maybe some of them are a little bit similar or kind of serve the same role, and they're shelved. It doesn't mean that they're failures, but it just doesn't mean that they're successes in terms of making it into guests' mouths at Noma. And that's the tricky side of R&D at a restaurant with such high standards that pushes so hard. So to keep myself busy, because if you're trying to fill your day with R&D, you just look to other avenues. And yes, you can make 1001 variations of piso or kombucha, and that's what I encourage everyone here to go and do, because it's really, really, really fun. But but at the same time, I still have to keep innovating. So I look to technologies, and even though we are the fermentation lab in the restaurant, we do a lot of just pure food science. So there is a machine called an ultrasonic homogenizer, which allows us to homogenize normally a miscible liquid, so you can take oil and water and make something kind of the texture of milk. And a couple other fun toys, the centrifuge.
But what's interesting is that in the book, you've really developed ways to, let's say, make koji at home. And that is something that's really unique for anyone who has this book, is that now you can go home, and if you go to a hardware store and pick up some cedar, you can build a box that, and try this at home, which honestly, I don't know that that's ever been done before.
And put in a maybe not, no.
Yeah.
But that's the whole point of the book. It's we definitely aim to demystify this world. You know, as a chef myself, even when I started at Noma, it felt very much like this ivory tower, the fermentation lab. You know, ferments would come down to your section, you would taste them, you're like, this is incredible, but I have no idea what's going on here. That team was working over there, and you were just drowning in mise en place. You didn't have time to ask those questions. And I very much remember saying to René when I started working on it, like, I have to make this book the book that I wish I had when I started at the restaurant.
I mean, it's pretty clear on Instagram, every chef in the world has pre-ordered this book. This is basically the foundation of, I think, a new culture of cooking in a kitchen. It was a little, obviously you're not precarious about giving away secrets.
No.
Know? And
I mean,
what do you hope happens from?
Much better food. And I mean, fermentation to us is incredible, and I think it will be for the ones of you who actually figure this out, because you have to figure it out. I mean, you can't just. It's like I always compare it to people who say, "Oh, next week I'm going to run a marathon," even though I never ran in my life. You're going to have to train and get to know it. It's not that difficult, but you will, once you do it, it simply becomes a tool that's indispensable. It makes cooking so much easier. It really, really does. I mean, imagine when you eat sushi and you put a little bit of soy in your nigiri and it's like, wow, that's it. It made the difference. Now imagine you have 200 things like that, and you're cooking in your home, and you understand how to work with these things. We call them our Legos. You know, when we start fermenting, we filled a box of Legos suddenly. And so it's up to us to figure out how to work them. And sometimes you can find that one ferment that you put 3 drops on, and it's like, poof, that's it. It's just perfect, you know. And so, it's all in there. It's everything that we do at the restaurant. I mean, and it is what we do at the restaurant. It's probably the only book about fermentation, to which there are many, but it doesn't have a sauerkraut recipe in it. Because that's not...
You have salted cabbage.
We have lactic acid fermentation.
Yes.
With other things, but not, not the typical, here are your, 101 ways of making sauerkraut. It is what we do at the restaurant, but try to put it in a way so that everybody can do it, and everybody can be inspired from it. And some of these things we worked on for 10 years. Some of these things we worked on for 2-3 years without figuring it out. But I also believe that's what Copenhagen is built on, this, put it out there. I think in the best case scenario, all of you will go ferment, and you will start experimenting, and you will put it on Instagram, all these brown splatters.
But we'll know.
Yeah.
And then, once in a while, one of you is going to do something that we just didn't think of.
Yeah.
And then we're going to be like, that's cool. We should do that.
Yeah.
And so, you're basically going to be working for Noma, all of you as you ferment.
This is all a very clever ploy.
You buy the book and work for us.
No, but it's true. It spurs the field on. It really does.
Yeah.
It really does.
You said make the fermentation lab proud. You made the fermentation lab proud. I think that's the goal for all of us. I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. If there's a microphone running around and people
Yes, I will bring a microphone to anyone who may have a question. Just a quick reminder around here, questions we like to say typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There's no such thing as a two-part question, and only Jessica gets to ask follow-up questions. Who wants to go first?
There's up here.
Professional.
That wasn't the question.
Super excited to try the stuff in the book. One question is, do you guys have any food safety precautions?
In the book, lots of them.
Great.
Or at the restaurant. Also, lots.
I guess for home cooks, I think I want to like make something. I'm like, hey, 2-year-old son, try this miso. I'm like, uh-oh, I got to take you to the emergency room.
There is. I mean, Sandor Katz's The Art of Fermentation is, it was the Bible for us in the fermentation lab, and for a lot of cooks out there. It's also a very different book. And one thing that always perplexed me was that his section on, cleanliness and safety is about 2 paragraphs long, which is, I was like, that's not, you need to, I think there is this, like, oh, what is fermentation? Or it's scary, because people haven't gone far enough with that. So there is a very thorough section in here, and I spend a lot of time talking about the microbes responsible for making all the things you buy at Whole Foods or you'll make in this book. And I also spend a lot of time talking about microbes that you would never want to see in your kitchen, but you should be familiar with them so you can understand how to avoid them, and where things can go wrong. So there's a lot in there about understanding what pH is, what salt does, and how to ferment safely. Yes.
And it's never gone wrong for you.
No, I eat everything that we make in the lab that gets served in the restaurant, and I've never been out with food poisoning or anything like that.
I have, but not from the fermentation. Not from the fermentation lab. That's from foraging, actually. That's much worse. You can die actually if you eat the wrong thing.
For sure.
I think home cooks might
Diarrhea is nothing on that.
I think home cooks might see mold on pisos or fermented items and fear that it's wrong and that they're going to throw it out. What advice do you have for people who see mold?
Can I read from the book?
Sure. Do you want?
No, I don't have to. I got it here, but it's in the book. A lot of times, the actual mold that you use to make piso or misos can catch again on the surface, and that's totally fine. If it's the same color of mold that you put into your miso, it's probably just growing a little bit, and it'll chill out after a little while. You can just scrape that off when you actually go to finish your miso. Then I talk about the fact that if you see other colored molds, that probably means that something you don't want to be growing is there, so be cautious. Yeah, so there's always ways to tell.
Okay, over here.
And one thing about actually just a follow-up on this, because yesterday we were talking to someone and they had followed a recipe for sauerkraut, and it was when he explained the recipe, it was incredibly wrong actually, and which made us realize that going online and just finding a recipe for this is you need to take care of that, and not just accept the first Google recipe for something because it can go wrong.
And salt, I'm assuming, plays an important role in this process of fermentation. Is there a specific salt that you would recommend to people out here?
Definitely. Sea salt is our number one. Don't use iodized salt, because it tastes salty in a way that salt does not taste. And it is mildly antimicrobial as well, so sometimes it can hinder fermentation processes.
How does your fermentation lab and process working, utilizing the whole vegetable or the whole piece of produce to minimize your food waste?
A lot of what we do in the lab comes from looking in the garbage can, I would say. And a lot of the recipes in here started from that, at looking at things that were being tossed out, and you say, okay, well, how can we divert this waste stream and turn it into something useful? Not all of them, of course, but I mean, the butternut squash vinegar that's in this book, that came from all of the bottoms that we couldn't turn into a perfect semicircle for the menu, and we would just juice them and keep them, and then have that vinegar on hand. And when we needed to pickle, we would always have ample amounts on round. The rose miso and rose kombucha were also made from food waste. So you'll see in the book where that comes from. But fermentation is an incredibly powerful tool for minimizing waste, so long as you use that finished ferment for something afterwards, or have an output for it that can actually go through the volume of the stuff you've created. Because that is kind of the other side of that scale, is that yes, you can make ferments from wasted products, but then you normally consume ferments in smaller quantity than you would fresh food. That's usually saltier, more acidic, so it's just something to keep in mind. Give it to your friends. Gift it.
So if you're a beginner at fermentation, what would you think would be the basic equipment to start with? I know maybe lactic acid and whey and salt, as you said, but what else in terms of tools and ingredients would you recommend starting with?
A mason jar.
It's in.
Yeah.
It's also in the book, actually.
Yeah. But
We thought of it all.
start with a mason jar, and you'll go a long way. You can do a lot with a mason jar. Yeah, and then
A heating blanket, Lars? Your grandmother's heating blanket?
that'll come in handy
Take that.
for sure.
Really, that's how we started, actually.
Very true.
What's one ingredient that you've noticed makes the biggest leap in terms of like flavor spectrum? In terms of like spicy to sweet, or salty to fruity?
For me, it's the koji just in itself.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you know what koji is? No.
It's a fungus.
We'll have the master.
It originated as a wild crop fungus that would, be a blight on rice crops in Southeast Asia, and slowly it was domesticated, like dogs from wolves, to be very useful to humankind. And it is remarkable. You will fall in love with it the first time you grow it. It transforms the starches in grains into sugars and makes them incredibly sweet. But then beyond that, the mold itself has this incredible flavor that's tropical fruit in its profile. So that alone is by far the most impressive. We're still in love with it in the restaurant. We use it in maybe 2/3 of the dishes in some way or another. It's amazing. Yeah, and then grasshoppers. From raw to finished,
That's amazing.
that's up there as well.
That's true. It was a big moment, the grasshoppers. You guys are from here in LA, where you have a very diverse group of people, and there's, I had tacos. And we all know that in Mexico they know what's delicious, but in a very homogeneous Northern European type of place, bugs are incredibly taboo food. And so for us to actually disguise grasshoppers, it's something everybody then people accept it. And it turns from grasshoppers into a liquid that's a mix between, I would say, soy sauce, and then also like a mole.
Yeah, with definitely a mole with chocolate in it.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's really amazing. And the first time we did it, we ordered grasshoppers, but we didn't know they were alive when we opened the box. That was pretty fun. And did you know that some grasshoppers, you can freeze them, and then when they defrost, they come back to life?
I was wondering, is there a major difference in quality between, say, fermenting out of cryovac bags and, just pressurized fermentating, with plates and a shit ton of plastic wrap, that sort of style of fermenting?
Yes and no. It depends on what you want. And I very much, as Jessica alluded to, I talk about the pros and cons of each method. If you're using food-safe plastic, and I think, like at our restaurant, we get food-safe bags that you can cook with that don't leach. We do that because we want to keep the shapes of the fruits or vegetables very whole. And normally when you have to, crush something under a big stick and then pack it into a jar and weigh it down, you're going to end up with a mash afterwards. That's not always what we're looking for at the restaurant. Now, in a home, if you just want small pieces of vegetable or fruit fermented, you can do that in a crock, and it's totally fine. And it saves on plastic, which we all know isn't the greatest material on earth. And you can just reuse your crock. So, yeah, there are pros and cons to each, and it just really depends on what you want out of it.
In the book, Dave talks about microbial terroir.
Mm-hmm.
So how
Dave Chang, not me.
Dave Chang. And I'm assuming that if you cryo something, maybe that will remove a little bit of that microbial terroir, or how have you found maybe fermenting things in Copenhagen different than when you go to ferment something in Tulum?
It's very different.
It really is. In Japan, when we were trying to do all the lacto ferments, and we were
First of all, in Mexico, in Tulum, you don't need grandmother's heating blanket. It's like the environment is the perfect fermentation chamber.
It really is. It would just, it was
probably
really
reduces time for the fermentation as well, or
for some. But I mean, for example, like if you look at what it takes to build a koji chamber, it's not impossible, but it's work. You have to go out and get things and put it together. Take up a big section of your kitchen counter. Your spouse will be very angry at you. And at the restaurant, we have this big elaborate setup. And then we went to Mexico, and it was like, just
make sure flies aren't hitting it.
Leave it on the counter and wrap it in a plastic in a garbage bag, and see you in 2 days.
Humid and hot.
Yeah, but as an anecdote, some of the lacto ferments that we were very used to, or at least their flavors in Copenhagen, didn't work in Japan. They just tasted wrong. They tasted off. Mm-hmm. Not rotten, but they didn't taste, so we didn't use them. And absolutely, each place has its own community of organisms. Just like you go to a tropical rainforest and see birds of paradise, and you can go to Antarctica and you see penguins. Your home will be different than your neighbors, will be different from my mom's in Toronto, will be different from René's in Copenhagen. And there are definitely communities that live on your hands, on your kitchen counter, that will all have their say in what your final food tastes like.
We have time for 2 more questions.
With fermenting soy sauce particularly, there's like, I don't know if there's like an umbrella rule for this, but like incorporating air. I just quickly saw this thing about like, you would stir it every day for 2 weeks in historical, techniques, and then leave it closed. But have you found like something with incorporating more air, or like anything in particular when it comes to what that actually does to the ferment?
I don't see a reason to stir it a lot, especially you're going to age it for 6 months. You would probably affect its flavor profile in some way if you kept aerating it and kept stirring it. And it's more about understanding what the microbes inside that vat of soy sauce need to do, and it is a community, and there are different ones that some will appreciate added oxygen and others won't. And once you understand what's actually going on, you'll say, okay, well, if I stir it, then I'll see maybe it'll be more acidic, or if I don't stir it, maybe it'll be slightly more alcoholic, or maybe any yeast that can tolerate the salt will produce more fruity notes, and then you'll start to understand what actions like that will have. But the soy sauce that we teach you how to make in the book will taste really, really good if you just follow the instructions. I'll say that.
But then again, remember that there will be differences. I mean, it will be really, really good, at least the way we see it, but you will have to adapt to the ingredients here and to what's going on in the air here. I mean, that's always the thing.
I mean, even when you bake something somewhere else, your milk is different, your flour is different. It's going to be the same thing.
Yeah. And maybe before we get to the last question, I would just like to talk about the cover of this book, which was kind of like, very much had to do with the last 2 questions. But the hand that's on here that's wrapped in a web of mycelial roots comes from a term that I learned from 2 Korean women that I met at Noma. and that term is son mat, which means hand taste. So now you understand what that cover is. And hand taste in Korea is the flavor of a fermented product or a handmade food that is very much tied to the moment it was made and the person that made it. And if you ask Koreans about hand taste, they will say that any miso or doenjang that you get from a factory lacks hand taste. And this idea of microbial terroir and the idea of adapting recipes to what grows where you are or how you make it or the tools that you have at your disposal are all elements of hand taste, and it is something very personal, and you come to realize that it is a very real thing when you start fermenting for yourself. So it's very much something to be appreciated.
And our final question for the evening?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I run a restaurant in Vegas. I do some simple, I do kimchi and some other, simple things, but I'm moving to a bigger location, and I'm really inspired by everything that you guys are doing, and I really want to make it a bigger portion of the bigger restaurant that I'm opening. So I'm just wondering what advice you can give me, because I really, really want to incorporate more into my restaurant what we'll be doing, whether it's a fermentation room or like anything.
Hire someone. That's number one. Really, I totally mean that. I mean, find someone that can help you with this, and let that person guide it. And you have to let that person also, of course, have the freedom and capacity. And just don't hire David. Yeah, that's the first step, in my opinion. Is if you want to take it to the next level, then you need to find someone that can really focus on it and make that thing grow for you. And if you find the right person, that person will make it much better than you could ever have dreamed of, like David has done for us.
It can be as easy as, if beyond just a person, if you want to start like somewhat small, like an alto sham, just a warming cabinet. If you're like a small restaurant or a medium-sized restaurant, just having one of those in the corner will allow you to do a lot of this stuff kind of, okay, not set it and forget it, but a little bit more efficiently. And yeah, it's really about affording the time, because while this is an amazing, there's a lot of people out there that are very happy that this book is in the world, because these ideas are in the world now, but once you get into it, you'll realize it's a lot of pain in the ass just chopping and mixing and blending and packing away, and the actual work of fermentation is quite menial kitchen work. But to give someone and afford someone the time to understand the processes and understand where the payoffs are going to come, that's more important.
Thank you very much.